Karridale is remote, located in the Lewin Ward, in the far southwest of Western Australia. In 1961, the area was agricultural, farms surrounded by eucalyptus forests and native bush. Defined by a Mediterranean climate, wet winters and hot, dry summers, bushfires have always occurred here. In the summer of 1961, the residents lived through an extreme bushfire experience that destroyed 100,000 acres, including the entire Karadale town site. But their careful preparations, courage and determination saw the community emerge from the ashes with no lives lost.
It was just a disaster waiting to happen.
It's 1961 and Perth is in the grip of a heatwave. Temperatures soar above the century, baking the country tinder-dry. Heavy rains in the summer and autumn of 1960 and a dry winter and spring mean fuel loads in the forests are high.
I know from memory that the forest around Karadale hadn't been burnt, either deliberately or otherwise, for over 15 years. Somebody worked it out from their memory when it was last burnt. And the fuel from the karri trees had built up to, I estimated, 8 to 10, 12 feet in those days, around the trunks of the trees. Well, when a bushfire goes through that, forget about what the greenies think about burning off. That kills everything then. Just kills the lot. All the microbiology, little bits and bugs and things that they're trying to protect, they're all dead. And so it takes a long time for those to recover.
We'd just come home from our first holiday. We hadn't had a holiday for quite some time. Well, we needed one. And we went east, drove east, and while over there we were in a theatre in Sydney watching Sound of Music, and the dwelling up went up in smoke, and Jack said, "We're going home."
We decided to take a break, a week's holiday down at Albany. We had a few days down there and the drive-in theatre came on, so we decided to have an early tea and go to the drive-in, and then we took the speaker off the stand and put it on the side window of the car, and the news came on. So they said there were fires in the Forest Grove area. I thought, well, it's getting late now and getting on for dark, and they'd probably get it under control. And I knew my boundary was fairly well burnt, you know, kept clean. I couldn't ring up Forest Grove because we were on manual exchanges, and they used to close about 8, you know. I thought, oh, blood, I better ring up first thing in the morning and find out if it was necessary to come home. We'd been to the drive-in and came home and had a cuppa and then went to bed. And about 12:30 a policeman came to our tram door and he said, your farm's on fire.
I really didn't know anything about the fire until somebody came to Augusta, because I was working at Augusta Cafe for Joan and Bill Hurst, and somebody from Karadale had come into Augusta and said that the fires were looking pretty serious. So I said, because I knew Mum was home by herself because Dad was in hospital, and I thought, well, I need to be home. So he agreed to take me back to the farm, and we drove from Augusta back to the farm on the Clouds Creek Road. But while we were driving, we were actually driving through the fire, and there was people stopping us and saying that we shouldn't go any further. The Karadale store had already been burnt at that time, and they were talking about the 44-gallon drums of fuel being thrown into the air so high that they just looked like baked bean tins. So it was so high up.
I was nursing at the time. I left here and I went nursing. And I remember matron waking me up and telling me that our family were on the front page of the West Australian. And that's the first we heard about the fires. We didn't even hear about them before that. And so she offered to give me time off to go down and see my family. But we got to Milk River and then they wouldn't let me through.
Well, I really can't remember anything before the fire. It was only when we were at school that day, and there was Pauline, myself and Claire, and in classroom, and then next minute the headmaster came in and said we all had to evacuate the school, and this was what we had to do. So we all had to go out and stand in the middle of the big tennis courts there, and everyone had to stand right close into the centre of the courts, and we were told that they were going to bring buses in. So it was all waiting, and all these buses arrived, and we all got on that and we headed to Augusta.
Well, from my way of thinking, that fire should never have happened, not down here. They blamed a Pop Holland up at Forest Grove for starting it, but that wasn't actually a fact at all. His fire only came down as far as Slabby Ford, and it never crossed the ford. And we were sitting on our front veranda one afternoon, and a chap came in and he said, "You folk are going to be burnt out tomorrow." And we said, "Why? How do you know that?" And he said, "Because the forestry have just come and lit from the main road across to the back road on a little 6-foot wide track across there." He said, "There's no way it won't jump that 6-foot wide track." So he said, when it does, it'll just come for Karadale and there'll be nothing to stop it. And what he said exactly turned out. It just jumped that little track.
So I set up the Emergency Management Centre in Karadale in Hubie McDonald's place on the corner there on the intersection. But it was the only big clear area apart from an oval. We needed somewhere that we had a little bit of communication, which was one phone call in Hubie's house sort of thing, but there was no good setting up anywhere else. No communication. No mobile phones, no radios in those days. It was just one landline in and out of the town then. But it worked.
Hubie rang from Busselton. He'd heard on the news that Karadale was badly burning, and eventually when they spoke to him, they said they couldn't get through to Karadale. They were off the air, that the fire had already gone through. And in the meantime, they had sent collie miners to come and fight the fire, and they camped in our backyard, and we had plenty of water, had a tank and also a well. But in the meantime, the fire came right through, and we had poly pipe on the ground, and it let the water go, and we ended up after 24 hours or so that we ran out of water, and so they had to move to Karadale. In the meantime, they stayed overnight, and I cooked them breakfast in the morning and for so many hours, and eventually people came from everywhere, and our drivers were bringing people's clothes, and Mrs. Johnson, the postmistress's clothes, they were put into our garage, and she came and her husband and stayed, and quite a number of people that didn't have anywhere to stay just stayed at our house, which was just lucky that it had only been built for 3 years, and it was meant to be there when the fire went through.
Then, well, something we shouldn't have done, we had a little standard 10, and Peter was only 15 years old, and my husband said, "You can put my hat on and look like," I mean, he could drive, "you can look like me, and you go down to Karadale store and bring Susan home." So off he goes, which he shouldn't have done, and Susan wasn't allowed to come home. She was told she had to stay and man the telephones, and I can't remember how she did get home.
We came up a long way. Instead of coming across the Brockman Highway, we went up Kojonup. We went through and up Boyup Brook, and that Brockman Highway was rough and gravel and that. It was breaking daylight when we got back to Forest Grove, and then there's this dirty big tree right across the drive. We had to cut a track around, clear the bush around the butt of the tree to get in. And then the wind got up, and then, although everything was quiet, the wind got up and then sparks was blowing off burning logs, burning trees onto the pasture that I had left. So Ethel and I and Peter, we got stuck into it and we got it under control, but we couldn't leave the property that day because the wind kept blowing sparks.
A group of collie unemployed miners had been sent to the area to help us. And they were looking around for a leader and couldn't find one, and eventually somebody suggested that I might be able to be some use to them, which I was, and they to us. And we were able to fight the fire successfully behind a large fire break. And in my case, I did a lot of my instructions from my black Holden sedan car, because it was a big break and I was able to run up and down it and be the big chief, you know, and encourage them to keep fighting, which they did.
Once they knew the fire was coming, final preparations had to be made.
Most of them had little grey Fergie tractors with a 2-furrow moldboard plough, and they just went berserk. Some of them ploughed up their water pipes, they didn't care, they just went round their buildings. People like myself, never even had a horse, never alone a tractor.
Jack went on the tractor and plough fire breaks around the house, and every now and again he'd shout out, "Water!" You'd have to race over with a bucket of water because the tractor had caught fire.
We came from Forest Grove, and the next day my husband said, "Oh, we'll keep Peter at home." He was 15, but the other two went to school. My eldest daughter worked at Karadale store, and it was a telephone place. She had to man the telephone. It was a plug-in and "hello, Mrs. all that business." And so my two youngest ones went to school as usual. Then the fire, it was a very hot day and a hot wind, a very, very strong hot wind. And you could hear the fire coming down the road. You really could. It was quite frightening. So Peter got on the horse, and I think he went back, because we back onto McLeod's Creek, and he rode over to McLeod's Creek to see, you know, what was going on there, but nothing at the moment. So he came back, and we just seemed to stay here and wait.
Yeah, I had to get on my horse and go and move the sheep to the green pasture. There was just a little bit of green pasture and we had 100 sheep. I put them on that down by the bridge. Then I had to bring the cows up to the cow yard. And my mother was there. Robin was a little girl, and mother was there looking after her. Then you just waited, you couldn't do much.
Confronted by the reality of a major bushfire and fully recognising their own vulnerability, these people fought, and they fought hard.
The fire went under our car and under the tractor, but we had to fight it out around the house, Liz and I, with wet bags. Runwood tank was empty. I had to pull water out of the dam and put in cream cans. So we fought the fire out with these wet bags. And we had to throw water on each other because your hair would frizzle up. You could hear our hair frizzling. I think they were taking most of the women out, evacuating them and taking them up to Hubie McDonald's. Even before it came across the road, it was lighting up behind our chook pens. Because we're up in the old house then, up the old group house. Chicken pens were at the back, and there were bits of bracken and stuff burning that landed there and started up fire. I don't think anything else could have been done. We fought the fire out, and it just, once we put it out around the house, it just raced away. All the hay burnt, the whole haystack burnt.
My brother was home, and I did ask him just recently why he was home on that day, and he said that Mum had heard that there were fires around and thought that she'd best keep him home from school. So we sort of rallied around and moved stock from paddocks to where they would be safe. We moved machinery and just continually hosed down the house and used our common sense to sort of see what we could do to make sure that most things were going to be saved. And then it was a lull time. It seemed like nothing was happening. There was lots of smoke around, but we hadn't heard from anybody or seen anybody. And I said to my mum, I'll walk up to the corner and just see if I can see, if there's anybody there or if there's any fire. And the fire had already started in the next door neighbour's property. But by the time I'd got back down to the house and I turned around, the fire was actually right behind me. And I remember just feeling terribly shocked, and I was sick. I actually vomited, and yeah, it was quite frightening. And to be quite honest, I don't really remember much after that. It was just, yeah, we just fought. Yes, just moved so quickly. And I do remember, you know, we were just hosing and fighting with, well, we didn't have firefighting equipment, we just used bags, and I think Mum had towels and blankets and things. And
run to our wood. I just took an armful like that of Frank's clothes, an armful of my clothes, laid them in there, got a big tarpaulin, buckets of water, and threw it over the whole lot and around us. And Ron was home from school. Ray was in Margaret River High School, and they wouldn't let him home. We had branches, green, you know, peppy branches, and as the sparks dropped around us, Ron and I beat them out. I'll never, never forget that, ever, ever. Oh. Anyway, we got through it all right.
The morning of the big burn of Karadale, Robin said, "Can I come with you today, Dad?" And he said, "No, I'll bring the fire to you." And meaning that it was going to be a pretty bad day because of the wind and the heat. And blow me, when I saw it, when I heard it coming, it sounded like a jet plane. And suddenly it was on the farm, and I was very angry.
We thought we'd lost a little boy down at Sunshine Avenue, I think it was called, down the bottom of Neil up down that way. So I screamed off down there to organise a bit of a search for this little kid. The bushfire had gone through the place. By the time I got there, they'd found the little kid. He's about 4 or 5 years old from memory. And he'd seen the bushfire, and there was a bit of panic then. Everybody had run and forgotten about him, but he decided the best place for him was in the dam. I said, "Well, what happened when the bushfire came in?" He said, "Oh, I just I put my head under the water." He said it was hot, the poor little bloke.
I had a secondary part in the Karridale fires, and did most of my fighting of it, with many others of course, in an area fairly close to my own farm, on Lewis's place and Stan Brindley's place. Stan was burnt out, of course, on the day of his wedding, and he was let go for his wedding, but his house survived. But it was touch and go for the rest of us.
The house across the road, we're now on Bushby Road, that farm was virtually burned. One little child got badly burned, her feet got burned. She fell in a hole with where the fire was burning, and that was really very sad. They weren't going very well, and they ended up having to move away.
I remember after my face was, you know, burning, and I can remember that night, the only place that you could feel any coolness was to lay out in that little bit of grass that was out the back and sort of put your face into the grass, and it seemed to be the only place that you could get any clear air just from the smoke. It was just so thick and horrendous.
There were some injuries, but no loss of life. Once the fire front had passed, the farmers of Karridale had no time to rest. These were livestock farmers with animals to care for.
That was the interesting part. There was 4 acres of pigs. I think we probably would have had about 100 pigs there at the time. We had a very big piggery, and they just squatted on their haunches and shuffled like that until they had a whole ring of sand around them. They just shuffled it around, and they were just lying more or less below ground level with this ring of sand around them, and they never got hurt at all. It didn't singe them or anything. No, they were quite all right. And that's the amazing part about animals. They just seem to automatically know what to do.
And then it was just frightening, just worrying where the animals were and what things had been burnt. And I know all the fences and all the feed and for the cattle had all gone. And then after, it was just trying to find food for the animals. We had milking cows, so they had to stay. But a lot of the younger cattle and dry stock was put out to other people who hadn't been burnt out and had, you know, spare feed and that.
The stock were taken away. Our sheep were all right. They were still, we didn't know if they were alive or dead. And they were on this green patch, and they stayed on that the whole time the fire was on. The cattle were, any that were close to calving, we kept home, and the rest were all adjusted away. And we learnt halfway through, ours were adjusted at Harvey, and we learnt that this fellow had had a fire on his farm and he had readjusted them somewhere else, unbeknown to us. He just, looked after them for us.
Let the pigs out, and there was a litter of piglets, and they went down to the creek, of course, so there was all this time. It took us months to get those pigs back in because they're good little swimmers. Chasing these pigs around for months after.
We had put in a new toilet, and so the toilet down the backyard was his chicken shed, and they were all in an incubator there, and they had the run of a yard as well. The first thing Barry said to Jack when he went up to Margaret River to pick him up was, "How are my chickens?" Jack was able to tell him they were okay.
There were some on strike, but there were a lot that were stood down. All underground mines those days, and a lot of them used to work in the bush cutting the props, what they used to use for the underground. Freddie Buckle, he was a timber worker. He came down after the fire because they were wanting people to come down and help do the fencing. He did a lot of fencing on the farms.
We were helped such a lot with the men coming from Collie, and they helped us with fencing, and they helped with the fire for a start. At the early fire brigade, if there was a fire at someone's place, the wives got to and made sandwiches and raced off to where the depot was so that the men could eat and have we took thermoses, and they needed food and drink on the job. Oh yeah, Joan Hurst had a little a shop there that's been pulled down now, a little cafeteria type thing. We all were able to cook. You'd cook a big pie or something and take it down to the depot because the men were all working there, getting the fodder to the right place and so on.
Then the next day, a lot of collie miners were sent here to backburn, and we fed them. But the Shire supplied the food, supplied butter, meat, and that, made sandwiches and that, and drinks. My two youngest ones were evacuated to Augusta, and there they slept the night. And I was talking to my youngest daughter this morning. She was 8, and she said, "Oh, I remember, Mum, they gave us cornflakes for breakfast."
And they told us then that we wouldn't be able to go home that night. So we stayed at the CWA rooms, and we had, I remember, just blankets on the floor with some pillows and things, and dinner was made for us that night. And I think it was probably 2 days, and most of the children went home, but then we were told that we weren't allowed to go home because we couldn't get home. So I can't remember how long we stayed there, but it was ages and ages. It just seemed like a lifetime. I sort of remember being really frightened because we couldn't go home. At first, of course, you're staying in this place and it's all fun because all the kids are there, but then after that the novelty wore off a bit, and you sort of started to realise something was really happening and it wasn't nice. So.
When I got down, Mum and Dad were in Charlie Jenkins's place and the house was gone. Everything happened the day before. There was Mum and Dad and my brother and that dog that we had in the car, Nellie. They lost everything except what my brother buried in Mum's veggie garden. And that was the Bible, the family Bible, and a little precious bag that Mum had, a little leather bag, brown leather bag with all the family photos. And they went back after and just unearthed it, and they were quite all right. It's surprising because that fire must have just swept through there so quickly over the ground, because the Bible still smelled, the paper still smelled of fire.
I remember thinking there's nothing between us and the ocean now, or Hamlin Bay, because the shop was next, the post office and shop, and store was Miller's Trading, Timber and Trading Company was next to where the park is now. Across the road was the old hospital, and the MC Davies, the big house, which was later shifted to Margaret River before the fire, luckily, so it's fine. And there were timber houses there.
Anyway, fortunately that night it did begin to rain a bit, and it was very eerie, you know, really. Oh, the birds weren't singing, there was no noise, it was very, very eerie. Anyway, the next day, Susan took me, she was able to drive, took me to Karadale to see what it was, and oh, it was absolute devastation. Everything was, you know, white ash, and oh, it looked dreadful. The old church had gone, all the mill houses had gone, beautiful store had gone, and the old hall, and they had beautiful dances there. The last dance, they were celebrating 60 years of the hall, and my daughter was belle of the ball.
People didn't whinge in those days. They really didn't whinge. They just got on with it, you know. And as Mum said, I've still got my two hands. We'll start up again. And that's exactly what they did. And I think that the whole town, the whole environment here was very tough and rough, but very caring for each other. You know, so that I think they had a pioneer spirit.
No, they're a tough lot, and if you weren't tough, you couldn't last. Yeah, when you imagine no electric light, you know, Coolgardie safes to keep a bit of butter that you probably had to make yourself, and so no, you talk about pioneer spirit, boy, that was tough. But the community spirit built up from that, and then that was passed on to the kids, and their kids, they're the people that are there now, a lot of them anyway. So, but at the old pioneer spirit there pushed them through life for sure. Hard times, there were hard times.